When perfect control meets perfect love, how God's sovereignty transforms anxiety into peace. The human mind, when gripped by anxiety, becomes a battlefield where fear wages war against faith. Anxious thoughts multiply like locusts, consuming peace and devouring hope until the soul feels overwhelmed by circumstances that seem chaotic and uncontrollable. Yet Scripture offers a powerful antidote to this mental torment, the truth of God's absolute sovereignty. When we truly grasp that our God is not merely powerful but perfectly in control of every detail of existence, while simultaneously being perfectly loving toward His children, anxiety loses its stranglehold on our hearts. This is not merely positive thinking or psychological technique, it is theological transformation that rewrites the narrative of our fears. God's sovereignty eliminates the terror of random chaos. The most fundamental way God's sovereignty eases anxious thoughts is by removing the terrifying possibility that life is random, chaotic, or meaningless. Anxiety thrives in uncertainty, feeding on the fear that circumstances could spiral completely out of control with no rhyme or reason. When we believe that events occur randomly or that we live at the mercy of chance, every potential threat becomes magnified because there is no guarantee of protection or purpose. However, Scripture presents a radically different reality. Psalm 135 verse 6 declares, "Whatever the Lord pleases, He does, in heaven and on earth, in the seas and all deeps." This comprehensive statement eliminates any possibility of randomness in God's universe. Daniel 4 verses 34 to 35 reinforces this truth. His dominion is an everlasting dominion and His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and He does according to His will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay His hand. These passages reveal that God's sovereignty extends to every detail of existence. As one source emphasizes, God is sovereign over which socks you put on this morning, how many grains of sand stuck to your feet at the beach yesterday, the flight of birds in the air, how many babies are born in a given city in a given year, who gets elected to public office, what nations make treaties or go to war with each other, the path of stars and planets, the movement of subatomic particles. When anxious thoughts suggest that circumstances could spin wildly out of control, the truth of God's sovereignty provides an unshakable foundation. Nothing happens outside His divine plan and infinite knowledge. This comprehensive control means that nothing that has happened or will happen is beyond God's knowledge or sovereign will. For the anxious mind, this truth transforms chaos into order, randomness into purpose, and uncertainty into divine orchestration. Every circumstance that triggers anxiety must first pass through God's sovereign will, eliminating the terror of living in a universe governed by chance. Divine meaning replaces meaningless suffering. Beyond eliminating randomness, God's sovereignty provides profound meaning to our troubles, which serves as a powerful antidote to anxiety. When we perceive our difficulties as meaningless suffering or purposeless pain, anxiety intensifies because we see no redemptive value in our struggles. However, when we understand that our sovereign God works all things according to the counsel of His will, Ephesians 1 verse 11, even our most difficult circumstances gain significance. As one theologian explains, the fact of God's sovereignty is a comfort because it gives meaning to our troubles. If God were not in control of all things, our troubles would be random events that had no higher meaning or purpose. The choice becomes clear: is it more comforting to think that the loss of your job, death of your child, destruction of your home, etc. are simply random events over which God had no control, or that He has a plan and that those events had a place in that plan? Romans 8 verse 28 provides the theological foundation for this comfort, and we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. This verse doesn't promise that all things are good in themselves, but that God's sovereignty ensures all things contribute to ultimate good for His children. When anxiety whispers that our suffering is pointless, God's sovereignty responds that every difficulty serves His perfect purposes. This transformation of meaningless suffering into purposeful refinement fundamentally alters how we process anxious thoughts. Instead of seeing circumstances as threats to our well-being, we begin to see them as tools in the hands of a loving Father who is working all things together for our good and His glory. Sovereign love creates unshakable security. Perhaps the most powerful aspect of trusting God's sovereignty is understanding that His absolute control is exercised by a God of perfect love. Sovereignty without love would indeed be terrifying. An all-powerful tyrant who controls every detail of existence would be the ultimate source of anxiety, not comfort. However, Scripture reveals that God's sovereignty is inseparable from His love, creating the perfect foundation for peace. As one source beautifully explains, this truth would terrify us if God's sovereignty weren't equaled by His perfect love, wisdom, and goodness. The truth of God's sovereignty allows us to rest in Him and His will without fear. When we understand that everything that touches our lives first answers to Him, and that, if He allows it or brings it, it must serve Him and work together for the good of His children and His glory, anxiety loses its power to terrorize us. The Gospel Coalition emphasizes this crucial point. Scripture reveals God as the loving King who ordains and oversees all suffering. If He were only portrayed as sovereign, we might be tempted to shrink back from Him in fear. But because He's also shown to be our suffering God, who willingly stepped into unthinkable affliction on our behalf, we can be assured of His goodness. The cross demonstrates that our sovereign God is not distant or indifferent but intimately acquainted with suffering and motivated by sacrificial love. This sovereign love means that no terror by day or night can threaten us. No one can ever truly hurt a Christian, because we know God's sovereignty means everything that touches our lives first answers to Him. When anxious thoughts suggest that we are vulnerable to forces beyond our control, the truth of God's sovereign love assures us that we are secure in Him and that the one who says He loves us is fully able to act on that love in all ways. Present peace through divine presence. God's sovereignty also eases anxious thoughts by assuring us of His presence in our current struggles. Anxiety often intensifies when we feel alone in our battles, but God's sovereignty guarantees that we never face our challenges without divine companionship. As Pathway to Victory illustrates through the story of Peter walking on water, rarely is it God's will to deliver you out of the storm. What He promises to do is walk with you through the storm. This truth transforms our experience of anxiety-provoking circumstances. Instead of crying out for God to remove every difficulty, we can trust that God walks with you through that storm to produce in you the invaluable quality of faith, the assurance that God is in control even when you can't see Him. The sovereign God who controls all things chooses to be present with us in our struggles, not merely to observe from a distance. Isaiah 46 verses 9 to 10 reinforces this comfort. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. This passage assures us that the God who knows the end from the beginning is intimately involved in our present circumstances. When anxious thoughts suggest that we are abandoned or forgotten, God's sovereignty reminds us that the one who controls every detail of existence has not overlooked our struggles. His presence with us is not accidental but sovereignly chosen, providing comfort that transcends our circumstances. In conclusion, trusting God's sovereignty eases anxious thoughts by fundamentally restructuring our understanding of reality. Instead of living in fear of random chaos, we rest in divine order. Instead of meaningless suffering, we experience purposeful refinement. Instead of vulnerable isolation, we enjoy sovereign love and divine presence. When we truly grasp that our God is both absolutely powerful and perfectly loving, anxiety transforms from a terrorizing enemy into a defeated foe. The sovereign God who numbers the hairs on our heads and knows every sparrow that falls is the same God who works all things together for the good of those who love Him. In this truth, anxious hearts find their ultimate rest,